Thank you very much for the warm introduction. It's always a pleasure being here with SUMSA. Now being the eldest amongst you, I feel very important. Without further ado, today's talk will deal with the Islamic principles of bioethics, as you all know. And it is a topic that is not often dealt with. In fact, I haven't heard many talks about Islamic bioethics, and so researching this topic took a lot of perseverance. The reason why I chose the title, Healthy, Wealthy and Wise, well, firstly because there was a show in the 90s, if you remember, on Channel 10, Healthy, Wealthy and Wise, and I thought it would be a good play on words. But at the same time, health, wealth and wisdom, or human intellect, are the very same principles that govern many other Islamic laws. And so we will see this very shortly, how the Sharia, which is often misinterpreted, governs the protection of health, wealth and wisdom. But in order to make this lecture a lot more interactive, I've decided to take on the PBL approach. You know, we get hammered with PBL every day at uni, doing a graduate course, so I thought that let's not use the very same principles to bore you all to death. But hopefully it's not the case. I'll start off with a scenario that presents an ethical dilemma, and hopefully by the end of the talk I should equip you all with some tools to help you reach a resolution. And this is how it goes. Mariam, apology to any Mariams out there, hope this is not a premonition, but a 38-year-old Muslim woman is diagnosed with breast cancer 5 weeks into her first pregnancy. She requires radical breast surgery followed by post-operative chemotherapy. She is advised to terminate the pregnancy before the chemotherapy. Now, I want you all in the next 30 seconds to identify the issues that you think are very important in this patient's presentation. Just think about anything that you might be thinking about, or perhaps the patient might be thinking about, in terminating her pregnancy. You don't have to write anything, don't worry. Oh, you can talk amongst yourselves, definitely.
Was it necessary to terminate, or was it just advised?
It was advised to terminate, but it's not compulsory. And of course, in medical practice, there's no such thing as compulsion. So
Was there reasons for that?
we'll talk about those, definitely, but I just want you now, with whatever previous knowledge you have, to be able to reach some sort of conclusion. Five seconds. Okay, so to terminate or not to. These are some of the issues that I've identified. First of all, she's 38 years old and she is coming to an age where conception becomes quite difficult, according to some medical opinion. And she's a Muslim woman, so there are principles governing her religion, I guess. And this is her very first pregnancy, so it's quite an emotional experience she's going through. And why 5 weeks in particular? Now, for those of you who've done embryology, 5 weeks is the beginning of organogenesis. In other words, in plain English, it's the start of organ development, and that's when this developing little human changes from a mere collection of cells into an embryo. Okay? So chemotherapy, for all the pharmacists out there, is when you give a patient some sort of drug, a cytotoxic drug, a drug that actually kills rapidly dividing cells in order to hope for remission, all right, or hope for a resolution of the cancer. And as we all know, when we were developing in the wombs of our mothers, the cells were rapidly dividing. And so this agent, this chemotherapy, will not just target those cells, those cancerous cells that are killing this patient, but will also target the fetus. And The fetus may therefore develop some strange anomalies, some strange side effects in their development. And so, putting all of these into perspective now, should she terminate her pregnancy? Now, how would Islamic bioethicists reach a conclusion? This is what I'm trying to develop today. And in order to understand this, this lecture will review or will provide an overview of three things. First of all, an overview of ethics itself. What is ethics? And how does Islamic ethics differ from Western ethics that we are well versed in today? Another thing we'll look at is the source of Islamic bioethics. Do we just sit down and talk about what we should do, what we shouldn't do, or do we have principles, or do we have scriptures that guide us through this? And do we solely rely on scriptures? That's another thing we'll also talk about. And towards the end, we'll have a look at a particular example of applied Islamic bioethics, mainly in vitro fertilization, IVF, and we'll talk about how Islamic bioethicists and Islamic scholars came to a conclusion regarding that procedure. And of course, we'll try to open the floor, if we have enough time, to get your opinion about this presentation that I gave a few seconds ago, Maryam's case. So, let's get started. First of all, what is ethics? Now, ethics is defined as a sub-branch of applied philosophy that deals intrinsically with right and wrong, good and bad, relating to a particular situation. So when given a particular situation, ethics tries to reach a conclusion as to what is good or bad, whether we should go ahead with this or we shouldn't. And bioethics is a subsidiary. It's a subset of ethics that deals specifically with biomedical issues that are either clinical in nature or those that relate to the investigational arena, biomedical research. How should we deal with animals? How should we sacrifice animals in research? Or should we only go for in vitro research, cell research? Today's talk will mainly deal with clinical bioethics, so it's applied bioethics. I hope I haven't lost anyone. If I have, I can start all over again. Blank faces, I've lost them. Great. All right. Hopefully, by the end of the talk, you shouldn't be confused. Now, this is what ethics is in a nutshell, and this is what bioethics aims to achieve, as I mentioned earlier. Now, how does Islamic bioethics differ from Western bioethics? What's interesting to know is that as Western ethics developed into a philosophical science during the Renaissance and following the age of the Renaissance, it moved away from a Christian conception of what good and bad is, of evil and virtue is, readily seen in some of the writings of Kant, the German philosopher, or, for example, St. Augustine, who was a North African philosopher, Christian philosopher. So this conception of good and bad, or evil and virtue, that was heavily rooted in Christian tradition, became diluted to a more philosophical arena. And instead of using scriptures as a source of guidance, human reason and intellect became the arbiter between good and bad. So that became the distinction of how we should go by good and bad. Let's look at human experience, let's look at what we've done in the past, and let's learn accordingly and reach a consensus there, from there. Now, the development from religious ethics to philosophical ethics was not paralleled in Islamic tradition. In fact, Islamic ethics does incorporate a bit of philosophical ethics. It does rely on some philosophical traditions. However, it maintains a religious worldview that is deeply rooted in scriptures, in the Muslim scriptures. And you could also extend it further to the Abrahamic traditions and scriptures. And to prove this point, I'd like you to now look at this marvelous manuscript. I'm really into manuscripts. I find them absolutely fascinating. And this one in particular was by Musa ibn Ibrahim al-Baghdadi, who was Iraqi at the time, when Baghdad existed, unfortunately. And he wrote a treatise on a commentary, he wrote a commentary on a poem by Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna in the West. And the title of this was Jawharun Nafis, Sharh Urjuzat Shaykh al-Ra'is. Now, I'd just like to go on a tangent here. Arab writers were known for their rhythm, or for their rhyme in their titles. So they wouldn't just say the commentary upon the poem of Shaykh al-Ra'is. They actually had to have some sort of rhyme going on in their title. And this is paralleled in many other scriptures and in many other texts that you may read in Arabic. But the aim of this was pretty much to give a commentary on a poem written by Avicenna describing some of the biomedical principles that he deduced. And what's interesting to note here is how this writer, Musa ibn Ibrahim al-Baghdadi, in his introduction makes the distinction on what medicine is from the Islamic perspective. Of course, no one denies the fact that medicine is extremely important, because if we did, pretty much all of us would not have existed today. We would not have been immunized, we wouldn't have had regular checkups, we would not have been to a pharmacist, we wouldn't have been to a dentist. Some of you are not visiting a dentist, I hear. You should, every 6 months, to keep us living. But these are very important principles that no one denies. But this is how he rationalizes the importance of medicine Islamically. And this is my translation. He says, every science has been honored by the nature of its content. The content of medicine is the body of man, as God exalted be, he says, and we have honored the children of Adam and carried them upon land and in the sea. He continues saying, the child of Adam, as in the human, was not created except for worship. And worship does not just mean the 5 ritualistic performances of salah, or prayer, zakat, charity, pilgrimage, hajj, etc. The meaning of worship Islamically is far more encompassing. But that's for another day. He says, worship cannot be fulfilled without a healthy body. Thus, through the knowledge of medicine, health can be preserved and, if necessary, restored. The need for this knowledge is immense, and the necessity in learning it is an obligation. And through this science, one may acknowledge the greatness of God Almighty. So we see al-Baghdadi resorting to the Quran, to a particular verse in the Quran, that exemplifies the importance of man, or of mankind, or of humankind, to be politically correct, in order to make his point regarding medicine. So we see this tradition of heavily relying upon scriptures. But the synthesis of Islamic bioethics really revolves around 2 points. The first being the Sharia, and we will talk about this, and the second being adab, or literature. And you may be asking, how can you rely upon literature to deduce bioethical principles? There's a long talk behind that, and there's a lot of tradition involved in that as well, which we will look at shortly. But first of all, what is Sharia? In Islamic sciences, we get very bogged down at times by defining terms, and it's important. We need to know what everyone means by a particular word. Sharia literally means the path to order. Did you know that? Sharia literally means the path to water, as-sabil ila al-ma'. Now, why is this so interesting? Because in the same way that water is the source of life, وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ, as God says in the Quran, and from water we've made everything alive. In the same way that water, H2O, gives life and gives existence to creatures, so too does Sharia. In a way, it guides you to the source of life from God Almighty. Now, from a legal perspective, Sharia is the corpus of legal rulings. It is the body of legal rulings deduced by fuqaha, or jurists who are well versed in this science. And very interestingly, it identifies the moral code of Islam at the same time. And we'll talk about how we deduce these moral principles in a short while. Now, on the other hand, adab, for those of you from an arts background, adab in Arabic literature means that which purifies your character. So it's a particular genre of literature related to ethics that helps develop you as an ethical human being. And one particular form of this genre was poetry. And we all know, or some of us may know, that poetry, oral traditions in pre-Islamic Arabia and in Islamic Arabia was something that was heavily relied upon. It was the form of propaganda for particular kings. It was a form of encoding sciences, as we saw Avicenna doing. And so it really infuses great moral principles in the reader, or at least it aims to do so. So these are the two sources of Islamic bioethics. Now to a bit more detail. How do we develop this Sharia, this path to order? There is a subset of, or there is a discipline within Sharia referred to as Usul al-Fiqh. And it literally means the roots of jurisprudential understanding. Usul al-Fiqh aims to identify sources of Islamic fiqh, and it also lays down the rules for weighing these sources in cases of conflict. And so, in order to deduce Islamic rulings, you need to have sources. In order to come up with a law, you need to have sources that you rely upon. And what happens when all of these sources are dealt with, but there is a conflict between them? How do we give priority to one over the other? Usul al-Fiqh aims to do this. And some of the sources of Usul al-Fiqh, or some of the sources of developing the Sharia, include tafsir, the Quran, the Word of God according to Islamic faith. This is Quranic exegesis, where we give meaning to the verses of the Quran as understood by the Prophet's companions, by the Prophet himself, by his companions, and by scholars that came after them, according also to a particular framework that is regularly, or at least in the past, was regularly revised. Unfortunately, not much synthesis in Islamic literature happens these days, one must say. The second source was hadith, the collection of prophetic traditions, commonly referred to as the Sunnah. What the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, did, acknowledged, or encouraged. And these are collected in, famous works by Al-Bukhari, who was a compiler of the Sunan, An-Nisa'i, Ibn Dawood, Muslim, Ibn Hibban, Tirmidhi, so on and so forth. Many, many people came, and there was also a science that was created to verify traditions, oral traditions from Prophet Muhammad. I'm trying to give a crash course into Islam or into Islamic scholarship. I hope I'm not losing anyone, but it's quite a detailed science. Then there is ijtihad and not jihad. Ijtihad comes from the root word jahada, which means to apply oneself to something, all right? To exert, absolutely. Thank you. It's always good to get support from the audience. To exert oneself. And so this is a form of deductive logic, where, according to a set of principles, or when there is something that scholars have not spoken about before, a scholar may deduce a particular logic or a methodology in order to explain or to come to a conclusion regarding a particular matter. Then there is ijma' or consensus. And ijma' is a consensus agreement about the moral or the legal assessment of a particular situation. Okay, so, for example, there's a particular issue that we all want to agree on or disagree on. We all convene, and then we discuss this, and what are the conclusions we reach based on principles, based on our different understandings, based on our experiences. We lay down a new law based on this ijma'. And these, of course, have different preferences and different priorities when deducing Islamic laws. And once again, the Sharia deals with that. Then there is qiyas, or analogy. And analogy, qiyas, literally means to compare or to measure. And this is, from a scholastic understanding, it is the juristic reasoning by analogy. In other words, in application, it stands for applying a ruling, a certain ruling from an established case, when the predisposing factors to that original case apply to the second case. I've definitely lost everyone here. Awesome. I love doing that. It's great. It gives me great pleasure. And then I'll bring you back into the light. So what qiyas basically means is that we have a particular ruling, and this is also used today in Western law, in the legal system, where there is a particular case that took place, let's say 2 days ago, and the judge reached a ruling, a particular edict. Now, based on that ruling, we look at the cases, at the predisposing factors that gave rise to that case and that gave rise to that ruling, and then we try to draw an analogy of those rulings to a situation that we are confronted with today. Making sense? Yes? Good on you. Now, this is qiyas. This is according to the Sunni tradition. According to the Shiite Ja'fari tradition, they use aql, or intellect, human reasoning, as opposed to qiyas. But I must say that Sunni and Shiite traditions, or Shi'i traditions, in usul al-fiqh are fairly similar. Then there is public interest, known as maslaha. So this is where we also look at public interest, and we weigh that. Should we do this particular thing today, or should we not? I'll give you an example. We've all heard about the floods taking place in Pakistan. It's a tragedy, of course, and our prayers go out to all those devastated. But Independence Day, the Pakistani Independence Day, coincided in that time, and so there was a ruling, given by the President of Pakistan or given by the Parliament, not to celebrate Independence Day on that day. Why? In public interest of those who've lost their lives. Okay, now I'm giving examples to make my case clearer. So this is where public interest is also used. Al-maslaha al-amma, public interest. And then we have urf, which is local customary precedents. So in this case, there is a particular qaida, a particular principle that says al-'adatu muhakkama, that al-urf, or the customs of a particular nation, could be actually used in deriving rulings when they do not contradict Islamic principles, fundamental Islamic principles. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of intercultural conflict arises, because of not looking at this in a holistic sense. So these are the most important sources of deriving fiqhi, or sharia-based principles. And they all aim to protect the following 5 entities, what we call maqasid al-sharia, the objectives of the sharia. The first being an-nafs, life; ad-din, religion; al-aql, intellect; al-nasl, lineage; and al-mal, property. And this is also, by the way, an ijtihad by scholars. So they've been able to come up with these 5 entities that sharia aims to preserve. But since we haven't been synthesizing much knowledge, unfortunately, in the past 150, 200, 300 years, these could change. But most importantly, there are things that will never change, like life. Who doubts the importance of life? Of all life. And as you can see here, an-nafs is given the indefinite form. We didn't say the Muslim nafs. We said an-nafs, any life. Animal, living, animals, humans, so on and so forth. Any form of life is given importance. And then we will define the meaning of life shortly as it relates to bioethics. So far I'm just trying to lay down the principles from which we deduce bioethical Islamic principles. Deen, intellect, religion is very important to preserve all forms of religion, not just Islamic faith, all forms of ideologies. Intellect, lineage, and property. These are the fundamental principles that Islam aims to preserve and protect. Now, based on these, 2 apply mainly to bioethics: life and lineage, and the E is missing. Great. Love technology. So life and lineage are the two fundamental entities that need to be protected in bioethical principles of Islam. And so as you can see, I've been trying to create a funnel here, a hypothetical funnel, where we have Sharia, then we have the sources of Sharia scattered everywhere, and then we're trying to funnel them into what Sharia aims to protect, those 5 entities, and from there we have further funneled a few important bioethical principles. And this is where the talk really starts today. First of all, going back to the Quran, the most important source of Islamic ethics, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God Almighty says, وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. Whoso saveth the life of one, it shall be as if he had saved the life of all mankind. Once again, we look at the indefinite form. God is not just saying, and whosoever saves the life of one Muslim, of one Jew, of one Christian, of one atheist, whoever. No, we're pluralistic in this sense of preserving all life. It is as if that person saved all of mankind. And so this is, I guess, the reward of preserving Islamic and non-Islamic life. A second principle is صحة الأبدان مقدمة على صحة الأديان. That physical well-being takes precedence over religious obligations. And we will look at this in a case very shortly. And then there is another bioethical principle, الضرورات تبيح المحظورات, that necessities override prohibitions. And another, درء المفاسد مقدم على جلب المصالح, that preventing harm is preferable to procuring benefits. Now let's give you a particular example, a new dilemma that should also enrich your understanding to be able to solve the first dilemma that we gave. Let's say, well, first of all, Islamically, the process of ensoulment of the nafkh al-ruh takes place at 120 days. So according to Islamic belief, it is known that God sends an angel upon the developing fetus on the 120th day to cast the soul into the developing human. And so our understanding of human life as a full human, okay, starts at 120 days. So now let us think about a mother with thalassemia major, a hematological disorder, a blood disorder, and she's worried that a child of hers may have thalassemia major as well, and they require transfusions, they require a whole conundrum of medical treatments. If she's pregnant, and the length of her pregnancy is less than 120 days, so she's in the first 120 days, she may undergo prenatal diagnosis, and if the baby is found to have a life-threatening condition, she may abort. Okay? Now, if it is after 120 days, then things differ. And this is the cloud that surrounds bioethics in all spheres of life. If the baby, if the developing human is okay, meaning that they do not have any congenital anomalies, they do not have any developmental defects, however, the life of the mother is at stake, then after 120 days, after this ensoulment process, the mother can abort. Because when you think about it, at a superficial level, if she did not abort and she died, then there is a high chance that the baby will also die. And so here we apply a number of principles. وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا, the first verse, that is a principle that is applied. So you are saving a human life. And we are also, in this case, giving physical well-being precedence over an Islamic obligation, over a religious obligation, which is, do not abort. This is after 120 days. And we also consider the third principle, that necessities override prohibitions. And so yes, there is a prohibition of abortion, that you should not abort. And I'm not talking much about abortion. Abortion is a whole maze of bioethical discourse. But I'm trying to sort of keep it at a okay level to understand, I guess. And then there is the last one, preventing harm is preferable to procuring benefits. So we're trying to prevent a greater harm by aborting after 120 days. So this is one way in which we can apply these bioethical principles to an ethical dilemma. Now, the second source of Islamic bioethical literature was adab. And we said that this was a unique literary genre in Arabic literature that advises to proper manners, that seeks to inculcate practical morals. And in fact, this form of literature flourished during the golden days of Islam, if you want to call it that, when Muslims used to think properly. Unfortunately, now we've taken our thinking caps off, or thinking turbans off. But during those days, they would develop manuals, ethical manuals for every profession to follow. And so therefore we can understand that this is a dynamic area for synthesis, is it not? And in fact, what is very interesting, and I'll give you an example of a scholar by the name of Ishaq ibn Ali Rahawi, who, along with a prominent Islamic physician known as Al-Razi, Abu Bakr al-Razi, also known in Latin as Arasis, they used Hellenistic writings, classical Greek writings, in the synthesis of their biomedical works. And so we can see that there is room for synthesis here. We can actually put our brains to use. We can actually come up with new literature that we can use to aid the development of a profession. Now, before I give you the example of Al-Rahawi, what are the aims of this adab? So we mentioned that yes, it is to inculcate practical morals, but specifically, it is to direct care and compassion towards the patient. Okay? It is also thought to believe, we believe that treatment efficacy depends on clinicians' righteousness. Okay, this is what they believed, that if you are a righteous clinician, you will be dedicated to what you do, you will take all actions necessary to improve the outcome of a particular treatment, and so therefore there is a strong favor for the patient to heal or to recover from a particular illness. And the third recurring theme is that ethical health is part of general health. In Islam, we don't have a dichotomy of entities. You know, there is no such thing as being a secular Muslim and being a practicing Muslim. You know, we try to amalgamate everything together. And unfortunately, once again, we haven't been doing this a lot. Living in a secular society at times, we are forced to demarcate the two. But in classical Islamic literature, there was no such thing as a demarcation of the two. And in fact, you saw in the manuscript, he began by praising the name of God. And this was a common occurrence amongst all scholars, Muslim or not. And Ibn Rahawi, that I mentioned earlier, developed or wrote a very nice body of literature called Adab al-Tabib, Practical Ethics of the Physician, which I would like to go into extensively in a moment. Ishaq ibn Ali Rahawi. So for all the Turks out there, you could say that he was Turkish, or for all the Iraqis out there, you could say that he was a northwestern Iraqi. He came from, everyone loves to own great people in Islamic history. So Ishaq ibn Ali al-Rahawi lived somewhere in the second half of the 9th century AD. So this city that he came from, Ar-Ruha, also known in classical times as, beg your pardon? Oh yes, the Edessa of Mesopotamia. And some people also believe that it was the birthplace of Prophet Abraham. I don't know whether that is right or not. But nonetheless, he lived in this town, he practiced medicine in this town, and thus his surname being Ar-Rahawi, the person from Raha, or Ruha, according to some pronunciations. And in today's context, it is in Turkish, on Lurfa. Apologies for my Turkish pronunciation. However, he was born a Christian, and there is doubt as to whether he fully embraced Islam. But nonetheless, he called medicine a divine art. And he also considered belief in the Abrahamic traditions as a necessity in the practice of medicine. Now, what is also very interesting is that in his literature, he commonly quotes Aristotle's Metaphysics, a well-known work of Aristotle. He quotes Socrates, he quotes Galen's On Ethics, and he quotes a number of works of Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, or the father of medicine. And what this shows you is that even for a non-Muslim living under the Islamic Caliphate at the time, using classical works and building upon them to synthesize a new body of knowledge is a fundamental Islamic principle that, as according to the saying of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, "Al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min fa'annama yajiduha fahuwa awla an-nas biha." Aw kama qala. So Prophet Muhammad says that wisdom is a lost treasure for a believer. Wherever he may or she may find this lost treasure, meaning wisdom, he needs to take it on board. This is a modern sort of translation, I guess. And we noticed that this intellectual harmony that existed at the time, especially during the Abbasid period, where a vast majority of classical Greek works were translated into Arabic, were preserved. We preserved, and I can say this with, not me, but earlier classical Islamic scholars were able to preserve classical Greek writings by translating them into Arabic and by writing critiques on them, and thereafter were translated into Latin and other European languages that were taken back to Europe after the Renaissance and during the Renaissance and whatnot. So we noticed that this person synthesized Islamic bioethics, or literature on Islamic bioethics, based on, or partly based on, Hellenistic traditions. Now, since I said that there is room for synthesis in this adab literature, what have we done today? In 1981, in Kuwait, there was a conference. It was the first international conference on Islamic medicine. And from this, there were 11 sections that were put together. And this is quoted from a journal article in Bioethics, which you can scribble down and look at. A very nice review article, by the way. They came up with these 11 definitions. Unfortunately, since then, we have not developed on this. It's with great sorrow that I say this. You know, from 1981 to 2010, okay, so we're looking at how many years? Who's good in maths?
28.
How many years?
28.
28 years. In 28 years, we haven't been able to change these, or at least update these. For God's sake, you know, you download Office XP, every second day you need to download a service pack, right? So can we not download a service pack for these bioethical principles? And this is an indictment, unfortunately, on the status of Muslim scholarship today. And we can see, you know, a few things, for example, professional secrecy. Who talks about professional secrecy today? You know, there is this explosion, there's a plethora of medical literature out there, excluding Wikipedia, right, that aids a patient in knowing more about their condition. You know, so therefore this ownership, even in pharmacy, you know, writing a script in yesteryears, when a doctor or a physician writes a prescription, they would use Latin. You know, and even today, if you ever, it's a time of sickness, colds, antibiotics and whatnot, if you do ever get a script, please look at it. You know, you'll find things like Mite, Fende, RX, and then you'd have things like BD, TDS, QID, PRN, Prorenata. What's this? What sort of secrecy is this? And so today, there is a strong push to use English for medical scripts, for pharmaceutical scripts. So something like this should be readily reviewed. And we all know that, you know, in the past, you'd go to the doctor, doctor is Mr. Know-it-all, you can't debate your doctor on anything, doctor gives you something you have to follow. It was a very paternalistic model they used to follow. However, today, we've moved to a more comprehensive model that looks at all facets of a patient's life, their biology, their psychology, their sociology, their ethnicity even, and also their religion. You know, the place for spirituality in medicine is also a topic that is discussed today. So that's a take on modern bioethical adab in Islamic literature. Now, before we finish off, I did promise you an example of applied Islamic bioethics, IVF. Now, for those of us who are not well versed in IVF, in vitro fertilization, in vitro basically means in a test tube, or that's implied meaning at least. What happens in this case is that, quite simply, eggs are harvested from the woman, and then sperm is collected from the male. They are fertilized, the egg and the sperm are fertilized ex vivo, outside the human body, and then when the developing cells reach a particular stage, we implant this into the uterus wall, into the endometrium, so that it may develop into an embryo and thereafter a fetus. Now, the reason why people actually perform IVF is for quite a few reasons. There are certain chronic inflammatory conditions that leave scar tissue, non-functional tissue in the ovaries that render the ovaries dysfunctional. They cannot develop eggs anymore, and so that leads to infertility. Another example is, as we can see here, the fallopian tubes. Those ropes that transmit or transport the egg from the ovaries down to the womb or to the uterus. Sometimes that might be blocked. There may be a developmental condition affecting it. Some patients, for example, who have cystic fibrosis cannot conceive, and so on and so forth. Endometriosis, which is unfortunately one of the most horrible conditions that can affect women. Endometriosis is when the endometrial lining, the inner lining of the uterus or the womb, starts to develop elsewhere in the body, and can affect the physiology, the normal operation of that organ. And unfortunately, one of the most common signs of endometriosis are the ovaries. And another one is when the woman is fine, but the husband or the partner has a low sperm count. Okay? So we can use IVF in order to short-circuit, I guess, the natural process so that conception may take place. So this is what IVF is for those of us who want to know more about it. Let's say a Muslim woman came in and she needed IVF. How do we approach this? Can we just take sperm from any donor? If anyone watches House, and I think it was season 2, who's the daddy? Yes, Cuddy was looking for a sperm donor. So she gives the grumpy house a few papers of candidates, and she's like, choose one for me. Of course, something like that would not take place Islamically, because remember how we talked about the preservation of lineage? And so therefore, we need to know that the husband is the father. There must be a husband, so they cannot be living in a de facto relationship. They must be wed Islamically. Of course, this is from the Islamic principles. You may debate this from another perspective, and you're entitled to do so. Marriage is current, so the we can't harvest sperm from the husband today and then preserve it in liquid nitrogen. And then 20 years later, if the husband dies, the mother says, "Oh, I want a son. I want to use my ex-husband's sperm, so I want to undergo IVF." The marriage is no longer viable because the husband died, and that is a requirement in Islamic law, so that cannot take place. And of course, the husband must be alive, as I said. And the marriage is current, also meaning that if we did harvest sperm, or let's say, hypothetically speaking, they come in today at 10 a.m., okay? We harvest the eggs, we harvest the sperm, and then at 12 o'clock, a divorce takes place, okay? And the IVF, the fertilization was due to take place at 1 o'clock. Can it still take place? No, because at the time of union of the sperm and the egg, you like the animation, during that time, the husband and the wife must be as they are, wed. So if there's any crack, we cannot proceed. Okay, so this is, once again, applying a few principles that we looked at earlier. So now going back, yes, I was trying to be fancy. So going back to our initial dilemma, what would you say in this case? And the floor is now yours. Should the termination take place, or should she still harbour this developing human? Now it's your turn to talk. And look, yes, there is a right and a wrong answer, but in these cases, there may not be. So the floor is yours. Everyone's shy. Boys have no clue. Girls. Yes,
Is the
madam.
therapy going to harm the baby or the mother?
Most likely it will. Most likely it will. It's a form of deleterious defect that we call non-stochastic. So,
To the baby or to the mother?
oh, to the baby. And the mother will also be affected, of course, you know, bone marrow suppression, her hair will fall out and whatnot, but it will definitely harm the infant.
Can they postpone the breast operations for after the birth?
Well, that's a good point actually. It depends on the staging of the breast cancer. So we know that breast cancer is quite a malignant cancer. It can metastasize, it can spread quite rapidly, and if it does, it's game over for both. So at this time, what do we do?
Well, I would definitely go for pregnancy because I've got to do termination.
Okay.
And I had toxic osmosis in the first trimester, and they advised me to terminate, and I did, and there was nothing wrong with my baby.
Excellent.
So for personal experience, I wouldn't do it. But from what you've told me, if that is the only option, I would terminate for the reasons you gave me. But I feel myself.
Sure. That's what Biothex is all about. Thank you very much. Yes.
Why would you terminate this pregnancy if the child already has soul inside him?
Sorry, if the child...
If the child is already got a soul inside him, who is 5 weeks?
No, this is before the installment process. And that's a catch. This is before 120 days. Saber. Terminate? What's your reason?
Well, wouldn't it harm yourself and the baby? Should we outweigh the benefits of the
So what's your reasoning? So yes, it will harm the fetus. Yes. It's not for sure that it will harm the fetus, but there is a high probability, a very high probability. Now, there's no such thing as 100% in life, right? But there is like a 99.95% that it will harm the fetus. But you're saying terminate, right? Because perhaps the baby may undergo some abnormalities during the development. Fair point. He's not a human. Excellent. Yeah. That's a point. Good on you.
The termination process, would it affect getting pregnancy later on?
Sorry?
Would the do terminate, would it affect trying to get pregnant later on?
It shouldn't. It shouldn't. There are drugs. You might have heard of IU486, during the whole debate of IU486 in the past. It shouldn't. It shouldn't.
Chemotherapy.
Sorry?
Chemotherapy will affect her fertility.
It may affect her fertility. That's right. It may affect her fertility, especially if metastasis does occur, if the cancer does spread to the ovaries. Anyone else? Go for it.
Her choice, though, whether she chooses to.
Yes. Yes. Of course, there's no compulsion in religion, right? You cannot compel anyone to do anything against their own will. However, there are repercussions to everything that we do, right? And that is why bioethics is such a sensitive issue, highly sensitive, and there's not a lot of synthesis occurring in it, unfortunately. Yeah. So, yes.
Would the mother die from breast cancer anytime soon?
She could. She could.
So would you want to bring out a baby without a mother who could be also disabled?
Wow. I didn't even think about that. That is also a very good point. That is a very good point. You should actually do bioethics. You'll be well fit for it. Yes.
Even if the baby was to have a long-term disability, would it be if the parents have the ability to take care of their disability and give their child the right environment? Would it be fair for them to give up on the pregnancy when they can sustain the baby in their condition?
Good point, good point. Interestingly, you come from a legal background, I know that. So, you like playing devil's advocate, so to speak. But looking after a child with a disability is one thing, and the child with the disability who has to go through the pains of their disability every day is a different thing altogether, and that's something we also need to be cognizant of. I would like to refer you all to what thalidomide, a drug that was taken, I think, as an anti-nauseant decades ago, and the effect that drug had on the fetus. You know, there were children who were born limbless. You know, what sort of quality of life will that child lead? There are also cognitive deficits that could take place. And these are all things that need to be thought of really well, because remember, you are responsible for this child. Not only for the physical upbringing of this child, but for the emotional upbringing, for the social upbringing, for the spiritual upbringing. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration. But it's a good point that you've mentioned there.
What's your opinion?
My opinion.
Yeah, you tell us.
My opinion. Well, my opinion doesn't stand. I'm not a... Look, it's a hard thing, you know. If I was the mother, I cannot be, due to my other Y chromosome. But if I was this person, I would choose to terminate. But this is where genetic counselling comes into play. That is a very important social service in our hospitals that unfortunately is not being taken very seriously in mass media. This is something that needs to have a lot of awareness raised about. I would say terminate, because I cannot guarantee that I would live through this. Why should I put my child at risk of teratogenic effects, of developmental deficits? I don't want to do that. It's before 120 days. Even if it was after 120 days, I would still terminate, because chemotherapy does wonders, but does disasters as well. Definitely. Shame up.
Well, you've also got the whole idea that mother is, she has a lot of independent on her. So say, for instance, she's got 4 other kids, she's got a husband, she's got her family around her. If she was to continue with with pregnancy, she still has breast cancer, and she dies, then there's a lot of people around her that are going to be affected by that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if it's just the baby, that dies, well, inshallah, will not anyway.
Sure.
And there's also that consideration that no one's actually dependent on the child, as say the mother is.
Sure.
And I think the ultimate decision really would be done after the mother, after she makes a safa.
Oh, definitely. That's another dimension that we did not talk about. Sorry, I have to cut it short. I think there's another class waiting outside. Thank you very much for your attendance. I hope this gave a lot of food for thought, especially for those of us who are fasting. So thank you very much.